My name is Ruth Thompson. I am 32 years old. I live in Vermont where winters bite through even the thickest coats. I married Dan Thompson 5 years ago on a crisp autumn day that felt like a scene from a Hallmark movie. His family kicked me and my newborn baby out of our house in the winter cold while Dan, my husband, stood there laughing. Before I continue my story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this YouTube channel, thank you. Now back to my story. When I first met Dan, it was the way he listened that drew me in. He had this steady gaze, a kind of quiet assurance that made me feel heard in a world full of noise. We met at a small bookstore cafe, both reaching for the same copy of an old travel memoir. I remember laughing when our fingers brushed, not realizing then that moment would lead me down an aisle toward him. Our early marriage was warm like those golden hour evenings in July. We'd take walks after dinner, talk about everything from politics to what our future children might look like. I loved how decisive he was about life, a man who made plans and followed through. I thought it was a sign of strength. His parents, May and Thomas, were polite the first few times I met them. May was all smiles and light touches on my shoulder, complimenting my dress or the way I had styled my hair. Thomas, quieter, would ask questions about my work as a freelance graphic designer. I tried to answer in ways that showed I wasn't just some flighty creative type. I was stable, dependable. I knew deep down I wanted their approval. During those early months, family dinners felt like gentle additions. I'd bring a bottle of wine, try to ask May about her garden, or listen to Thomas recount old fishing trips. It was easy, almost natural. But even then, there were moments I couldn't quite place, like the time May laughed a little too long at a story Dan told about me burning a pie, or when Thomas gave a subtle smirk after I said I didn't know much about hunting. Little ripples that felt harmless in the moment, but now, looking back, I see them differently. When Evelyn was born last winter, my world shifted. Her tiny fingers wrapping around mine, her small sighs as she slept against my chest, nothing compared to that love. Dan was proud, almost glowing, showing her off in every photo and video. His parents came to the hospital with flowers and a plush blanket, smiling down at her like she was their whole world too. But beneath those smiles, I started to feel something off. May would reach for Evie before I had even settled into a seat, her hands almost snatching rather than offering. She'd remark on how Evelyn's nose looked just like Dan's, and how hopefully she'll have the Thompson temperament. I tried to brush it off as harmless grandmotherly pride. Dan didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. Whenever I mentioned feeling edged out, he'd say, "They're just excited." "Don't overthink it, Ruth." He had this way of making me feel like my instincts were misplaced, like I was searching for shadows in the sunlight. Till we carried on. Christmas was approaching, and May invited us to stay with them for the holidays. Thompson home was a sprawling colonial with a wide front porch and a living room big enough for a 12-foot tree. I imagined Evelyn's first Christmas there, the stockings, the family photos, the fire crackling in the hearth. Part of me wanted it to be perfect, to mend any small frictions I had sensed. But as December deepened, so did the cold in the air, and I would soon realize in our family's heart. Started subtly, like a hairline crack in a frozen pond. Small enough to ignore at first, but widening with each passing day. The drive to May and Thomas's house was long, the kind where your breath fogs the windows and you sip coffee just to keep your hands warm. Evelyn slept most of the way, bundled in layers so thick she looked like a tiny pink snowman. Dan drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other fiddling with the radio. We didn't talk about the tension I had been feeling. When we arrived, May came to the door before we could even ring the bell. She swept Evelyn into her arms without a word to me, her smile wide, her voice high-pitched with delight. "Oh, there's my little girl," she cooed, as if I wasn't standing right there. I reminded myself she was excited, that it was her first Christmas as a grandmother. But small moments began stacking like snowflakes into a heavy drift. Dinner the first night, I tried to share a funny story about Evelyn's new habit of making squeaky noises in her sleep. May interrupted, saying, "Oh, she's always quiet when I have her. Babies can feel when they're with someone calm." The table laughed, but it wasn't the warm kind of laughter. It had an edge. Dan chuckled too, glancing at me like I should find it harmless. Later, while I was nursing Evelyn in the guest room, I overheard voices drifting up from the kitchen. May's was sharp but low. "She doesn't know what she's doing, Thomas. You can tell she's never been around babies. Poor Evie." I froze, my milk let down stalling as my cheeks burned. By the third day, May's opinions became less veiled. She criticized the way I swaddled Evelyn, the brand of formula I had as backup, even the soft wool hat I'd knitted. "This will make her head itch," she said, plucking it off before I could answer. Dan was nearby, laughing softly, as if this was some harmless family quirk. I wanted to leave. I even told Dan one night, lying in the too-soft bed under the heavy quilt May had insisted we use. "It doesn't feel like they respect me as Evelyn's mother," I whispered. He sighed, his voice quiet but firm. "Ruth, it's just family. You always think the worst. Stop being so sensitive." It was the last thing I wanted to hear from him. The snowstorm arrived on Christmas Eve as predicted. Thick, swirling flakes pelted the windows, the wind howling like something alive. I spent most of the day in the guest room with Evelyn, trying to avoid another critique or sly remark. But by evening, May insisted we all gather in the living room for cocoa. She sat with Evelyn in her lap, Thomas in his recliner, Dan on the sofa. I perched on the edge of a chair, my chest tight. May spoke about how lucky Dan was to have married someone willing to learn, her tone dripping with condescension. I smiled politely, but something inside me had begun to crack. I could feel the cold air outside creeping into my bones, though the fire roared. When Dan stepped outside later to help his father bring in more firewood, May leaned toward me. Her voice was low, but the venom was unmistakable. "You don't fit here, Ruth. Not in this family, not in this house. The sooner you accept that, the better for everyone." I stared at her, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Evelyn stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand curling tighter against my sweater. That was the first time I thought, really thought, about leaving before Christmas morning. But I didn't. Not yet. I didn't know then that the next day the cold wouldn't just be outside. It would be standing in my own doorway, pressing in like ice against my skin. Christmas morning should have been joyful. The snow outside lay thick and undisturbed, glittering under a pale sun. Inside, the scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the air, but my chest felt heavy. I had barely slept, lying awake replaying May's words from the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the way her lips curled as she told me I didn't belong. Still, I wanted to keep the peace for Evelyn's sake. I dressed her in a soft red onesie with tiny reindeer on the feet, wrapped her in a warm blanket and carried her downstairs. May was already there, bustling around the kitchen. Dan sat at the table sipping coffee, his eyes glued to his phone. Thomas was outside shoveling the driveway, though the snow was still falling lightly. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly, adjusting Evelyn on my shoulder. May turned, her smile tight. "Merry Christmas, Ruth," she replied, her gaze dropping immediately to Evelyn. "Come here, my darling." She held out her arms without looking at me. I hesitated, my grip instinctively tightening around my baby. May's eyebrows lifted, and Dan glanced up briefly, then went back to his phone. I finally handed Evelyn over, reminding myself it was just for the holiday. We opened presents in the living room, paper and ribbons littering the floor. Evelyn slept through most of it, her little chest rising and falling against May's sweater. I received a knitted scarf from Thomas, a cookbook from May, and a new set of drawing pencils from Dan. I should have felt thoughtful, but the room was colder than the wind outside. The real shift happened after breakfast. May and Thomas disappeared into the kitchen, speaking in hushed voices. Dan sat on the couch, watching a football recap. I was upstairs nursing Evelyn when I heard the sound of the front door open, and then slam shut. Curious, I came down to find May standing near the door with my coat in her hands. "We think it would be best if you took some space today," she said, her tone crisp and final. I blinked, unsure I'd heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" "You're making everyone tense," she continued. "It's Christmas. Go cool off somewhere. You can come back when you're ready to be part of this family." Dan was in the room now, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. There was a strange smirk on his face, like he was watching some sort of performance. "Maybe it's a good idea, Ruth. Get some air. You've been wound up lately." My mouth went dry. "It's snowing. You want me to take our newborn out in this weather?" May shrugged. "You'll be fine. People survive a little cold." I looked at Dan, searching his face for some sign of solidarity, some flicker of the man I married. Instead, he let out a short laugh, not loud but sharp enough to slice through me. Something in me broke right then. I went upstairs, my hands trembling as I dressed Evelyn in her thickest layers, tucking her into her carrier. The snowstorm outside was quieter now but still biting. My boots crunched on the icy porch as I stepped outside, the door closing firmly behind me. No one called me back. Cold hit like a slap, stealing my breath. Evelyn stirred against me, letting out a small whimper. I pulled the blanket higher around her, my arms aching from holding her close. The wind stung my cheeks, turning them raw within minutes. My boots sank into snowdrifts, each step heavier than the last. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was I couldn't stay there another second. Behind me, I imagined the three of them inside, warm, dry, maybe even laughing. The thought burned hotter than the frost biting at my skin. That morning, Christmas stopped meaning what it once did. It wasn't about family or tradition anymore. It became the day I learned that cruelty can wear a familiar face, and sometimes the person you expect to defend you is the one who pushes you out the door. The wind had a way of finding the smallest gaps in my coat, slicing through to my skin. Each step was a negotiation with the ice beneath my boots. Evelyn was silent now, her face tucked deep into the folds of her blanket, only the faintest warmth rising against my chest to remind me she was there. The road stretched ahead, quiet except for the crunch of snow under my feet. May and Thomas lived a good distance from town, their house tucked away in a neighborhood where the driveways were long and the neighbors far apart. I thought about knocking on the nearest door, but the homes here were large and closed off, the kind where strangers were met with suspicion, especially on Christmas morning. My phone was in my coat pocket, but when I pulled it out, my fingers numb, the battery was down to just a few %. I called my friend Hannah, who lived about 20 minutes away. The signal crackled. "Ruth? Are you okay? You sound." "They kicked me out," I said, my voice shaking. "Me and Evie. We're outside." "I can't." The line cut out before I could finish. I tried calling again, but the phone went black in my hand. Dead. I tightened my hold on Evelyn, breathing warmth into the small space between us. My mind was racing. I knew I couldn't just keep walking. The storm had eased, but the cold was still dangerous. My legs felt stiff, my fingertips aching even inside my gloves. The end of the street, I spotted a flicker of light through a frosted window. A small, single-story house, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. I hesitated before making my way up the short walkway, the snow piled high on either side. I knocked, my gloved hand making a dull thud against the wood. For a moment, nothing. Then the door opened a crack, and a man in his 70s peered out, wearing a flannel shirt and suspenders. "Lost?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "My name's Ruth," I said quickly. "My in-laws, I had to swallow hard before I could finish. They told me to leave. I've got my baby with me. Please, I just need somewhere warm until I can reach someone." He looked me over for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in before that little one freezes." The warmth hit me instantly, the smell of wood smoke and something sweet, maybe apple pie, filling the air. I stepped inside, the man closing the door firmly behind me. Evelyn stirred, letting out a small sigh. "Name's Walter," he said, motioning toward a worn armchair near the fire. "Sit. You look half frozen." I sank into the chair, my body thawing painfully as the heat seeped back into my limbs. Walter disappeared for a moment and returned with a quilt and a steaming mug of tea. As I sipped, I told him enough to make sense of why I was there without spilling every detail. He listened, his face neutral, though I could see something flicker in his eyes when I mentioned that my husband had laughed. "That's not right," he said finally. "Family's supposed to pull you closer in the cold, not push you out into it." His words settled deep. Walter's daughter, as it turned out, lived nearby. She came within the hour, her SUV rumbling into the driveway. She took one look at me and Evelyn and ushered us into the car without a single question, promising to get us to Hannah's place. The ride felt long, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Hannah's house glowed with golden light, the windows fogged from the warmth inside. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with Evelyn, her eyes filled with tears. She took us in without hesitation. That night I sat in her guest room, rocking Evelyn to sleep while the snow fell silently outside. I thought about the Thompsons, about Dan's crossed arms and faint smirk, about May's cold dismissal. I thought about how close we had come to being in real danger that morning. But more than anything, I thought about the moment I stepped over Walter's threshold, that simple act of kindness from a stranger who had nothing to gain. In the middle of a season that was supposed to be about love, it was a reminder that sometimes it's the unexpected people who save you. Hannah's home became our shelter for the rest of the holiday week. Her living room smelled of pine and cinnamon, the tree twinkling in the corner, gifts still tucked neatly underneath. She didn't ask questions the first night. She just handed me a warm blanket, a plate of leftover roast chicken, and told me to rest. When the shock began to ebb, the reality of what had happened settled in, heavy and cold. I had been thrown out of a house in the middle of winter, not by a stranger but by my own husband's family. And worse, my husband had been there, not just silent but amused. That image of him, leaning against the wall with that smirk, replayed in my mind over and over until I could barely breathe. The morning after my phone finally charged, I saw missed calls and messages from Dan. None of them were apologies. "You need to calm down. It wasn't that serious. Come back when you're ready to talk without making a scene." Each message chipped away at whatever love I had left for him. It wasn't just the act of locking me out, it was the dismissal of it afterward, the way he tried to twist it into my fault. Hannah sat with me at her kitchen table, Evelyn sleeping in her bassinet nearby. "Ruth," she said softly, "this isn't just about one bad Christmas. It's about respect. And you can't teach someone to respect you if they've decided they don't have to." She was right. Over the next few days, I made arrangements to stay with my sister in Maine. I needed distance from Dan, from May and Thomas, from that house with its wide porch and cold heart. Packing up the few things I'd brought for the holidays felt strange, like closing a chapter one hadn't planned to end. Before I left, I called Dan one last time. I told him I wouldn't be coming back. Not until he understood what it meant to stand beside me, especially when his family didn't. His response was clipped, almost bored. "If you're walking out, don't expect me to chase you." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Driving away from Hannah's, the snow had begun to melt, leaving behind slushy patches of gray. Evelyn slept in her car seat, her tiny breaths fogging the air. I glanced back at her in the rearview mirror and made myself a silent promise. She would grow up knowing that her worth was not up for debate, not something to be decided by anyone's approval. In Maine, my sister welcomed us with open arms. Her home was smaller, humbler, but it was filled with warmth, the kind you can't fake. We spent New Year's Eve in our pajamas, toasting with mugs of hot cocoa while Evelyn lay curled between us. It wasn't the life I had envisioned when I married Dan, but it was a life where I could breathe without fear of being shut out. Months have passed now. Pain isn't gone, but it's quieter. I've started therapy, learning to untangle the knots of guilt and betrayal. Dan sends occasional emails, none of them asking how Evelyn is, just updates about himself. I don't reply. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think about Walter, the stranger who opened his door on that freezing morning. I wish I'd told him that he had done more for me in that moment than my own husband had in years. Maybe one day I'll find a way to let him know. This past Christmas, I didn't decorate a big tree or host a dinner. I strung a single garland over the mantel and lit a few candles. It was simple, quiet, and safe. And when I held Evelyn close, I realized something important. Home isn't the place you're told you belong. It's where you are seen, valued, and protected. Thompson's house was never my home. But now, for the first time in a long while, I have one. It was late February when I heard the news. I was in my sister's kitchen, making oatmeal while Evelyn babbled in her high chair when my phone buzzed with a message from Hannah. You won't believe this. I opened it to see a local news article link. The headline made me pause mid-breath. One dead after family trapped in home during winter power outage. My stomach tightened. The photo beneath the headline showed the Thompsons' snow-covered street. The article detailed how a sudden ice storm had swept through Vermont, knocking out power for thousands. The Thompsons' neighborhood had been hit especially hard. Downed trees blocked their driveway and their generator had failed. Temperatures inside the house had plummeted. Dan, May, and Thomas had been stuck for nearly 2 days before emergency crews broke through. When rescuers finally entered, Thomas had early frostbite in his fingers, Dan was confused and disoriented from the cold, and May hadn't survived the night before. The report said her body temperature had dropped too low to recover. Severe frostbite had set into her extremities, and hypothermia had overwhelmed her before the ambulance arrived. I set the phone down slowly, the spoon still in my hand. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity either. What I felt was something in between, a sobering reminder that life doesn't always give you endless chances to choose kindness. Hannah called me later that day. Thomas is in the hospital, Dan's with him. They're a mess. The house is ruined, burst pipes, flooded floors. And Ruth? May's gone. Just like that. I didn't speak for a moment, letting her words settle. The same biting cold she had once told me and Evelyn to be fine and had turned on her, this time with no one there to open the door and offer warmth. I remembered that morning vividly, her hand gripping my coat, her voice cold as she told me to leave. I remembered Dan's laugh. And now I pictured that house, dark and silent, the air inside colder than the snow outside, and May feeling that creeping numbness in her bones. It wasn't joy I felt. It was finality. The cruel thing about winter is it doesn't care who you are. It shows no favoritism. The same wind that bites a stranger will bite family too. Sometimes life doesn't need you to deliver justice. It has its own way of evening the score. And in that score, May's chapter had ended, not by my hand but by the same cold she once thought I could endure with a newborn in my arms. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe to this YouTube channel for more stories.